Hi, folks. Another one of my How Not to Bleed Red in Tony's Classes videos. And in this particular one, we will be talking about how to quote and incorporating quotes into essay writing. Really rather important. It's the thing that gives you the authority to make your arguments. It's your evidence that proves your points. And so I thought it'd be good to try. Today we'll be using Instructions for Crossing the Border by a Jewish poet named Dan Pagas, born in Romania, put into a concentration camp in the Ukraine, Holocaust survivor, moved to Israel, wrote poetry about it, among other things. This is called Instructions for Crossing the Border. Imaginary man, go. Here is your passport. You are not allowed to remember. You have to match the description. Your eyes are already blue. Don't escape with the sparks inside the smokestack. You are a man. You sit in the train. Sit comfortably. You've got a decent coat now, a repaired body, a new name ready in your throat. Go. You are not allowed to forget. Okay, so if we're going to quote from this poem, we're going to be using what's called the SSS method, not the SS, the Nazi Secret Service, but the SSS method. The first one is you basically do the speaker, the spoken, the situation, the orientation, who's saying the quote that you're actually putting into the paper, who's speaking it, what's going on, what's the situation, what's going on at the time the quote is being said, where does it come from. The next would be support, your concrete detail to support your thesis, that's to say your actual quote. And finally, the significance, your analysis of that quotation, how that support proves your thesis, how that support proves your topic sentence for the particular essay in which it is located, okay? So, for example, when you do the significance, that's the analysis after the quotation, you don't have to be so direct as to say, this quote this quote proves the significance of this quote is. You can just jump right into your analysis, explaining what the textual reference means. And you want to use about 1 to 2, maybe 3 sentences or more to analyze the quote. Generally speaking, the analysis should be longer than the quote itself. Okay, so here's an example. As you see in the blue is the situation, who's speaking, the first S. The second S is the quote itself, that's in red, and then the analysis is in yellow, SSS method. Another of Pagas's Holocaust train poems, Instructions for Crossing the Border, dramatizes the escape of a Jew by train under a false identity. You have to match the description. Your eyes are already blue. In a series of instructions on how to pass as a non-Jew, one of the instructions is particularly chilling. Don't escape with the sparks inside the smokestack. You are a man. You sit in the train. The train is his mode of escape, but it could, if he is detected, turn into what transports him to the death camps. Therefore, the ovens of the camps become equated with the train's burner. If the refugee ceases to be a man who sits in the train, he will have only that other escape, becoming the sparks inside the smokestack, human smoke staining the sky. Okay, so you can see that there's that block quote in the middle of 3 lines, as well as a bunch of little pull quotes that are integrated into sentences, so that the poem itself is quoted quite substantially, but not all at once. Rather, I've integrated some of the smaller quotes into the orientation of the blue. I've got the longer quote in the middle, and then even the analysis also involves quotation, so that in effect, All three elements have support. Okay. So, as you see, we're citing a poem. And your second paper, at least, will be about poetry. And therefore, you really need to know how to cite poetry versus prose. It's a different sort of thing. First off, the poem you're going to be discussing, unless it's quite long, must be typed up or scanned or photocopied and attached to the back of the paper. Since it's going to be a digital document, scan it in. You take a photograph of it with your phone and attach it like that if you like. There are also various apps that can convert photographs into PDFs or scan from your camera into, like your phone camera, into a PDF. So, okay, so the first thing is attach that to the back of the paper with the idea that you don't want to send people running to the textbook to be able to read the poem. The poem is short enough, you can attach it to the back of the paper so that I can refer to it when I'm grading the paper quickly. Next, if you are quoting from poetry within a sentence, you use what's called parenthetical citation, a parentheses after the quotation that includes the author's name and the line number. Now, if this were prose, it would be the author's name and the page number. But because it's poetry, it's the author's name and the line number, like lines 3, 4, 5 in the poem. Now, the key thing is that parenthetical citation, that set of parentheses, is part of the sentence. So you don't put the period in the sentence before the parentheses, because that would mean that part of the sentence is after the period, right? So you put the period after the parentheses, not before it. And similarly with a comma, you put that afterwards, not before it, if you're gonna quote partway through a sentence. You would put the quotation marks at the end of the quote, then the parentheses, then the period. I'll give you an example down below. You don't want to include extraneous punctuation at the end of the quotation. So let's say the quotation ends with a period. Well, the problem is if you put that period in, that becomes the period at the end of your sentence, when the period at the end of your sentence is actually after the parentheses, after the quotation mark ends. So you would end up putting two periods in the same sentence. You would be stopping the same sentence twice. Doesn't make any sense. Similarly, if you put a comma there, you're basically ending a sentence, comma, period. You would never do that normally, so you wouldn't do that when you're doing a quotation. Simply delete the punctuation at the end of the quote and use the regular punctuation at the end of the sentence. And again, once again, don't put the page number, but rather put the lines of the poem that you're quoting in the parentheses, okay? And you'd also put the author's name in the parentheses, unless it's clear because from the context, or maybe you've quoted the author's name in the framing sentence. So for example, Shakespeare asserts that, quote, beauty's rose might never die, unquote, parentheses, line number, parentheses, period, right? You notice that you'd have no extraneous punctuation after die because the punctuation comes after the two parentheses, right? Similarly, or rather differently, an incorrect way of doing it would be Shakespeare asserts that beauty's rose might never die, period, parentheses, one, unparentheses, and then quotation mark. That period should not go there. The period should go after the parentheses, and the quotation marks should not go after the parentheses, because the parentheses are not part of the quote. That's not what you're quoting. The parentheses with it, one inside it, are telling you what the lines are. I seem to have done 1 and 2. I'm kind of mixed it up there, but okay. Then the final example, you'll see there the extraneous quotation. You have the same quote, but after die, you have comma, and then you also have the period, and you also have the quotation mark in the wrong place. So in brief, you end the quote, quotation mark, parentheses with the line number, and then the period at the end of the sentence. Okay, that's the order. It's not that hard. Just kind of try to get it into your head and go over your quotes after you write the paper to make sure you're using the correct format. Otherwise, what's going to happen is I will have to mark every single example of your quotation as a mistake, and your paper will bleed red. And that's not good for you, but it's also not good for me. It's a pain in the butt. I don't want to do that. Don't make me bring out my red pen or my red tool in PDF. Okay. Now, let's say you're quoting some lines of a poetry within the text, within the flow of your paragraph, not as a standalone quotation in what's called block quote format. In that case, because poems have something that prose does not, poems have line breaks, and line breaks have a lot of importance to a poem. They are where we pause, where we go around a corner and we come upon something unexpected. Line breaks are really essential to the structure of a poem. Therefore, they are indicated when you quote poems within the flow of a sentence as you use a slash to indicate those line breaks. And then, of course, as before, you'd use the author's name followed by the line number in parentheses at the end of the quote. Also, whenever you're quoting from a poem or prose, whatever, the citation itself has to be in the works cited. So you can't simply say, Dan Pagus, and have that be it. You also have to give the source of the poem, and you create a works cited list. I'll go over how to do that. So in other words, this is sort of like it's almost like a hyperlink, right? So the parentheses tells you the line numbers of the poem or the page numbers of the prose and the author's name. Then you go from the author's name down to the works cited, and you can find out, if you want, where to find that poem yourself, you as the reader. Here's an example from John Ashbery, American Poets. They dream only of America. They dream, let's say, open quote, right? They dream only of America, slash, there's a line break there, to be lost among the 13 million pillars of grass, unquote, parentheses. We haven't mentioned John Ashbery's name, so we would go Ashbery, then the line numbers 1 to 2, end the parentheses, and then the period. All right, remember the period does not go at the end of the quote, it goes after the parentheses, and you use a slash to indicate that line break, okay? Next, okay, so as mentioned before, use that slash to indicate the line breaks in the body of the text, but also remember to give context to the quote in your framing sentence. Don't have a free floating quotation where you have your paragraph and then you have an entire sentence by somebody else popped in there, and then you go back to your next sentence. You should create a framing clause to open up the sentence and then quote them as the quotation as part of your sentence. So here's an example. The speaker of Sonnet 1 begins by claiming that, quote, from fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. And then the end of the quote, Shakespeare 1 to 2. Comma, but then complains that the lover hoards her beauty and so condemns her beauty to die unloved. So the key thing here is, right, the quote itself is contextualized. We see who's speaking it. We see where it's spoken in Sonnet 1. We see that the speaker is making a claim. What's the claim? The quote gives us the claim. The parenthesis tells us who the author was and what lines were being quoted. And then the analysis continues afterwards. So the sentence itself gives you a total frame for that quotation. It's not like you have one sentence and then you quote the Shakespeare as a whole other sentence, and then you have another sentence, okay? Framing. You're giving a frame. Okay, so that's if you want to quote within your own paragraph, within your own sentence flow, in-text citation. There's also block quote format, which I'm sure you're familiar with from your essay writing from other classes, but nonetheless, they are used for whenever you have quotations of three lines or more, as in, here's a block quote, they dream only of America, to be lost among the 13 million petals of grass. This honey is delicious, though it burns the throat. And then Ashbery 1 to 4 in parentheses. Okay, couple of rules on how to do block quote format. And if you ever forget, just look it up. It's so easy to find on the internet. First off, you indent 10 spaces. You have a double space before it, and you have a double space after it, okay? You don't just run it into your sentences, right? You have a spacing. There are no quotation marks around it because it's already set aside by being indented 10 spaces and by having a double space before and afterwards, right? It's already a block of text that you're quoting. It's clear that it's a quote, so you don't have to put quotation marks around it. However, if there is a quotation that is already within the quote, for example, in the original poem, "This honey is delicious, though it burns the throat," is a quote in the poem itself that's set off with quotation marks in the poem itself. You maintain that and you show those because you're quoting it, right? So you have to quote the punctuation as well. Okay. And then, of course, cite the author's name and the line numbers in parentheses after the last line on the same line as the last line. So that's block quote format. Here's more about quoting from poetry using block quote format. Let's say you don't want to quote all four of those lines. You want to only quote lines 1, 2, and 4. You would do a line of periods to indicate that a line has been dropped out. "They dream only of America, to be lost among the 13 million pillars of grass, though it burns the throat." Okay? So, and then you see it goes Ashbury 1 to 2, that's lines 1 to 2, comma 4. So in other words, you're doing lines 1, 2, and 4, but not line 3. Okay? Now, let's say you don't want to drop an entire line, but you want to drop a few words and then add some of your own words to give context. So in that case, you would use ellipses to indicate the words you've dropped. Ellipses are ... and brackets to indicate words that you've changed, capitalized, changed the, pluralized, or inserted your own words. So "they dream only of America" becomes "the citizens," in brackets, because those are your words. That's what you're indicating they are, right? "Dream," and then you've dropped "only of America." "The citizens dream," ellipses, "of being lost among the 13 million pillars of grass." They originally said "they dream only of America to be lost." So instead of being "to be," it's "of being." It makes more sense grammatically. And say, this is, again, you try to make it make sense grammatically, "This honey is delicious, though it burns the throat." Okay, so it's Ashbury, lines 1 to 4, but the brackets indicate what you've changed, and the ellipses indicate what you've dropped. Okay, it's a bit advanced, but it tells you how to do it to make sure that the quote you're quoting says what you want it to say, without, of course, misquoting or taking things out of context, in such a way that the grammar is right for your framing paragraph. Now, let's say you're quoting within a sentence and you want to adapt the quote to fit your sentence grammar. It might be that the quote's in the past tense and your sentence is in the present tense, or something like that. So again, you would use ellipses to indicate text has been dropped and brackets to indicate you've changed or inserted words. An example is Emily Dickinson writes a, quote, "dialogue between / indicating a line break, ellipses indicating something has been dropped out, spirit," and brackets, "death." Death is your own indication, in which death tells spirit to dissolve, and spirit responds by casting off the flesh like an overcoat of clay. So you see how dissolve and overcoat of clay continued within the sentence, but you've changed certain words to make it flow better and dropped certain words to make it flow better. And then, of course, you show what you're quoting from, lines 1 to 3 and lines 7 to 8 in the parentheses. You don't have to say Dickinson in the parentheses because the sentence starts out saying Emily Dickinson writes. It's already clear from the context, okay? Now, punctuation and quotation marks. Now, this is really rather important. You put commas and periods inside of quotation marks, but put colons and semicolons outside of quotation marks. What way I like to think about it is the small punctuation marks go on the inside, and and the large ones go on the outside. And of course, the exception is exclamation marks and question marks, which I'll talk about in a minute. So correct, Emily Dickinson writes a dialogue, comma, and then quotation mark. And the argument takes place between death and the spirit, okay? You don't go dialogue, quotation mark, and then put the comma outside. You put the comma inside. Incorrect. Emily Dickinson writes a dialogue, and you see that they're the commas on the outside. This is probably the most common mistake that students make in college, okay? It's a really good rule to learn because basically it means if you don't learn it, every time you quote just about, you're going to be making a mistake. And annoying your professors just a little bit. They love you, but they don't want to have to correct you every time you quote. It gets a little bit, repetitive. So be kind to yourself, be kind to your professors, and learn this rule. Very simple. Commas and periods go inside quotes, colons and semicolons on the outside. Correct. Emily Dickinson writes a dialogue, end quote, and then the semicolon on the outside, not the inside, because it's a big punctuation mark. However, comma, the speakers are not human. Incorrect. Same thing, except of course the semicolons on the inside, and that's why it is incorrect. Now, I promised to tell you about exclamation marks and question marks. The rule is very simple. You might say those are also big ones. Don't they go on the outside? In truth, what you do is, because it changes, exclamation mark tells you not just pause, but be excited about what's been said. And question mark says not just pause or stop, but in fact question, put the thing in the form of a question, the sentence in the form of a question. Therefore, if your quote already is a question or already ends with an exclamation mark, you put those on the inside of the quotation marks to indicate that's what the author is asking or being excited about. If, however, you, as the author of your paper, are being excited or asking a question that the author you're quoting from isn't, then you put them on the outside. It makes perfect logical sense if you think about it. Okay, works cited list. At the end of the paper, you need to have a works cited list that lists all of the sources that you quote. I'll say that again. At the end of the paper, you have to have a works cited list that lists all of the works that you quote or cite in the paper itself. And there's a particular format for it. You put it alphabetically. The author's names are last name, comma, first name. You follow, for poetry, the author's name followed by the title of the poem in quotation marks. Essays would also be in quotation marks. Books would be in italics, right? Movies would be in italics. And then include the details of the source where the text was published. So, example, here's a poem in a book. If the poem is from a collection of a poet's work, add the name of the book in italics, the publisher of the year, and the page or page range on which the poem appears. So, Rich, comma, Adrian, that's Adrian Rich, but last name first, comma, first name, period, Fox, title of the poem, in quotes, Fox, poems 1998 to 2000, that's in italics because that's the title of the book, comma, and then publisher W.W. Norton and Company, comma, 2001, the year published, comma, page 25, period, okay? And then I have some other examples here. I'll let you take a look at it. You basically, I think, what I usually do, I'll look up, I'll just Google works cited list and let's say what it is I'm quoting, the URL of an online resource or a poem in an anthology or a poem on a website. There's different rules for each ones. I can't go over them all right now, but it's important to get it right. Okay, well, so I did say I was going to talk about a poem on a website. This particular one talks about poems on a website. And the key thing is not only do you do the URL, the address of the poem, but you also you write down when you accessed it, the date on which you accessed it, because the idea is that websites are not permanent. They're not published in the same way that books are, that and therefore, just as you might have to give the edition of a book, if a book has come out in different editions, you have to give the date on which you accessed it, because that web page can change. Someone else can edit it. It's a living document, like a constitution. And on that note, I wish you well and good luck.